Here's a sight that we will probably never see again. Two Lancasters in the air together, the only two Lancasters flying in the world. Battle of Britain Memorial Flight aircraft and the Canadian one that's come over. Lancaster leading the way, being flown by Tim Dunlop. Canadian one had an engine problem a couple of weeks ago, and they borrowed a new Merlin from the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, but their original engine was a Packard Merlin, so basically the same, but they had to swap over all the ancillaries, carburetor, superchargers and things, and they're followed by two Spitfires and a Hurricane. So this is the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. Three Spitfires, not a Hurricane there. So the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, I think, have got 5 Spitfires, got 3 of them. We're not sure which ones they're flying this weekend, but 2 of the Spitfires are flown by Tony Parkinson and the boss of the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, Johnny Stringer. Lancaster, an amazing airplane, could carry a bomb load of 22,000 pounds, and I'm sure you've seen the wonderful Dam Busters film, and could fly at 275 miles an hour. It looks pretty slow and ponderous, but actually it nipped along, and more than 7,000 of them were built during the war, 3,500 of them lost on operations, and we shouldn't forget that they were flown by young men aged 19, 20, 21, and 53,000 of them took off and didn't come back. So it's very nostalgic, and I think it's something that young people nowadays should be aware of, the sacrifice that these guys made. And of course, a bit later on we'll see the Mustang Ferocious Frankie. The Spitfires, of course, didn't have the range to accompany the bombers all the way to their target, but the Mustang did. It'll be great to see the 4-ship based here, which will be the Spitfire, Mustang, ME-109 and Hurricane together, and we've got an amazing V16 noise on the ground as well at the same time, because we've got the BRM display.
Yes, amazing. This is the BRM V16, 1.5 litre centrifugally supercharged engine, and they were recalcitrant, but they were rather wonderful, and they raced here in period. Made the most extraordinary noise when they were chiming on all 16.
Had a centrifugal supercharger like the Merlin, but didn't work very well.
And what was interesting is if they thought the V16 was complicated, they then came up with the H16, which won one race with Jim Clark in a Lotus in period. There, your aircraft again, Chris.
So I just correct my correction. It is 1 Hurricane and 2 Spitfires. You can tell the Hurricane, of course, the Spitfire has that amazing elliptic wing, and the Hurricane, earlier technology, really a monoplane version of the earlier 1930s biplanes, both Merlin powered, of course, but the Spitfire Merlin engine eventually developed about 1,700 horsepower. The Hurricane, early Hurricane, with an earlier Merlin, about 900. There's the Hurricane, slightly different shape, much higher cockpit, so easier to see over the nose on landing. One of the problems with a Spitfire is that as soon as you flare for the landing, you can't see anything ahead of you. So you'll notice that when the Spitfires come in to land, they do if you like, a semicircular final approach, so that the pilot looks down one side of the engine cowling and can see the runway ahead. Interesting that the Hurricane was much quicker and cheaper to build than the Spitfire. Hurricane took 10,000 man-hours, Spitfire 15,000, so the Spitfire at the time was a pretty expensive airplane to build. And something like over 20,000 Spitfires were built. If you include the Seafire, which was the carrier-based version, was something like 22,000. The BBMF Lancaster, the British one leading the way, was built in May 1945, so never really saw action. It went straight into storage, and then went to South Africa for survey duties, and they planned to put it on static display at Hendon, but luckily it joined the BBMF in 1973 and has been constantly maintained, beautifully maintained in flying condition. But isn't it wonderful to have the Canadian one over, actually built in Canada by the Victory Aircraft Company at Malton in Canada in July 1945. And in 1952 it had a serious accident, it needed a new wing, but then the Canadians used it for maritime patrol until 1963. Then it was on outside display from 63 to 77. You can imagine the corrosion and deterioration, and it went through an 11-year rebuild and flew again in 1988. And it's dedicated to a Canadian Flight Lieutenant, Andrew Minarski, who earned the Victoria Cross by saving his rear gunner, who was trapped in the rear gun turret when the aircraft was going down, and the rear gunner survived, but Andrew Minarski didn't survive and got a posthumous VC. On the ground, we've got our ground-based, Goodwood-based airplanes this weekend. Ferocious Frankie, the Mustang, MH434 Spitfire. And the Spitfire is being flown by Lee Proudfoot. One of the problems with the Spitfire is that, as you can see, the left undercarriage leg blanks the radiator, and so you can only keep a Merlin engine of a Spitfire going on the ground for about 6 or 7 minutes before it overheats. There's Alistair Kay in the cockpit of Ferocious Frankie. Stu Goldspink is flying the Hurricane. I'm not sure if we're only going to see the Mustang and the MH434, but here are the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight Spitfires and Hurricane. And they're, I think, going to land here, while the Lancasters, who of course wouldn't land on this relatively short grass runway, are going to be based in Bournemouth. So a run and break by the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight fighters to come into land, which means that when they're on the ground, or maybe when they're in the circuit, Lee and Alistair will take off in MH434 and Ferocious Frankie. What a wonderful sight. And what a wonderful day. Clouds are building up from the east, but I think we're going to have a reasonably high cloud base this afternoon, so hopefully and fortunately it's a lovely flying day. Look at the two Lancasters. There is a third Lancaster based at East Kirby in Lincolnshire. Belongs to the Fenton brothers. They bought it in memorial of their brother who was killed in Bomber Command, and that aircraft is not flying at the moment. It does run, but they're hoping to get it back in the air. There you see the curved approach of the Spitfire, flaps down, wheels down.
I've just noticed that's a clipped wing Spit, isn't it?
It is, and that was used more, I think, for low level flight, ground attack. So not really a fighter to fighter. Nice, almost a 3-point landing, low wheeler landing, and then the pilot has to pedal fairly agilely on the rudder pedal to keep it straight. And with a Spitfire, you have to be pretty careful not to put the brakes on too hard on landing, otherwise it tends to tip on its nose and you'll get very unpopular with the owner. Second Spitfire coming in. The Hurricane is actually relatively easier to land, more docile on landing than the Spitfire, but they're both beautiful airplanes to handle. Later on we'll see the Messerschmitt 109, the ME 109, although in fact it's a Bouchon 109 built in Spain with the Merlin engine, which John Romain will be flying, and that's a much, much trickier beast on the ground. Hurricane landing, and you can see that the pilot does sit up considerably higher and so has a reasonable view straight ahead of the runway. 3 Merlin engines. Well, with the Lancasters, 8, 9, 10, 11 Merlin engines. How about that? There's Ferocious Frankie, Mustang. P-51D. I only found out the other day what the P stood for, because modern American fighter planes are F, of course, for fighter. P was for pursuit, which I thought was rather a sweet way of describing a fighter aircraft, and really a hangover from World War I. And the later versions of the Mustang were in fact F-51, so they decided that they weren't pursuit, they were fighter aircraft, which of course they had been all along. I'm sure you know that the Mustang was built to a British specification and designed and built in an incredibly short period of time in America by the North American company, and the purpose of it was as a long-range escort. And the Mustang had a range about an 8-hour endurance. Can you imagine flying that 8 hours there and back? And so they were fitted with drop tanks made of cardboard, which they used until they got probably over the Netherlands, and then they released the drop tanks. So surprised Dutch people got a lump of cardboard in their garden. But the cockpit of the Mustang, from an ergonomic point of view, i.e. from the pilot's logic of the controls and things, is much better than the Spitfire. Spitfire controls are sort of chucked at the control panel haphazard. And one of the things you'll notice when a Spitfire takes off very often, that one is taking off, but of course it's a very experienced pilot at the controls, that's Lee Proudfoot, is that you have to swap hands on the control stick, because the undercarriage lever is on the right, the throttle is on the left, and so on takeoff you have to take your hand off the throttle and hope that you've tightened up the screw that stops it coming back and leaving you without engine power. Put your left hand on the stick and use the right hand to lift the undercarriage. And you often see a Spitfire really wobbling around when the pro pilot tries to do all these things at once and get the undercarriage up. Cars are coming out for the next practice session, but let's for the moment focus on these two glorious aircraft. Later on they'll be joined in the air by the Hurricane and the ME-109.
At Woodcote there's a point at which you can get onto the tractor-drawn trailers. And also to fill areas.
Grip is synonymous with the American V8s. We've got Plymouth Barracudas, Ford Falcon Sprints, Ford Mustangs, Daytona 500, Dodge Dart, and the Mercury Comet Cycle. And Emanuele Pirro, be interesting. They're in very good form down in the assembly area. I walked past about 10-15 minutes ago. A bit of a chance to nip out while the bikes are on, left in the capable hands of Barry Nutley. But yes, great drivers. Full field again, and the talent is just endless. Back live then at the 2014 Goodwood Revival, and good to see a packed house as we have the Jaguar D-types coming out for their parade. We're going to have aircraft overhead very shortly, and we can see them at 11 o'clock. So I'd like to hand over now to Chris Druitt for our aircraft display. Chris, good afternoon.
Thanks, Marcus. There we are, the wonderful Canberra PR9 and the two Hunters of Mid-Air Squadron, and I'm joined by Mike Davis, who runs Mid-Air and is making a business case for these wonderful airplanes displaying. Mike, let's talk Canberra first. Amazing aircraft that was in service for well over 50 years. Immensely powerful. and achieved amazing altitudes, didn't it?
Indeed it did, Chris. The airplane's reputedly been well past 70,000 feet, and I'm forbidden to say who actually did that, but he wouldn't be too far away from that airplane right now. The aircraft has a tremendous role in the photo reconnaissance world. Still to be replaced, I think.
Yep, designed by Petter, who also designed the Lightning. Two powerful Rolls-Royce Avon engines, quite a long way out on the wing. So am I right in saying that if one engine decides to fail on takeoff, unlike cramming the power on the other one, you actually have to cut back the power to stop it turning sharply towards the failed engine?
That's very correct. I think you need to be also looking to see what's in front of you at the time, or just 10 degrees to the left or the right, just in case. But you need an awful strong left or right foot to keep it under control. But the VMCA, or the minimum control speed in the air, is in fact relatively slow. So the airplane is controllable, but it's a handful.
It is. It's a great big wing. I mean, it's not an immensely fast airplane. We'll talk Hunter in a minute, but it's lovely to see these three aircraft together. We've seen Canberra and Hunter before, but I don't think at Goodwood we've seen Canberra and two Hunters.
No, in fact, nobody's seen the Canberra and these two Hunters together. This actually is our first. We've launched them from Kemble on a couple of occasions, but this is the first public event.
Isn't that a wonderful sight?
It's the most amazing sight.
Canberra being flown by David Piper, who you say is like a kid in clover with flying this aircraft.
David was one of the last pilots to fly that aircraft in service in Afghanistan, basically. Delivered the airplane to me through the MOD in 2006 and thought he'd never see it again. And as I say, he is a child on Christmas Eve, basically.
And you got it flying again last year, but it could have flown the year before. You had a lot of paperwork to sort out.
Indeed. Yes, a lot of new rules came out, and we had a lot of explaining to do as to why we couldn't rebuild an airplane to modern specs. But with the Civil Aviation Authority being very pragmatic, we've managed now to... This is our 17th show this year, which I think is quite spectacular, frankly. To see those three together now,
isn't that wonderful?
Is very, very rewarding indeed.
And to start the Canberra engines, it used to be a cartridge starter, which was a big bang and a puff of black smoke, and I don't think those cartridges are easy to get hold. So you've converted it onto electric start.
Indeed we did. That was a very carcinogenic, toxic and very unstable way of starting an airplane.
Yeah.
The Air Force tried to do it, and I'm afraid with the Ministry of Defence budget they couldn't, and we did it for about £200, but I won't go into that.
Let's look at Hunter, the wonderful, graceful Hunter, designed by Sidney Cam. Motto, if it looks right, it is right, and that certainly applied to the Hunter, although initially not. It first flew in July 1951, flown by the great Neville Duke. All sorts of problems to begin with the early ones. When they put they had the air brakes and the flaps combined, and when the pilot put the air brakes out, the thing pitched steeply downhill, which doesn't help very, very much. And then they tried firing the cannon, and out came the cartridges and damaged the bottom of the airplane. So they had to do quite a lot of work before the Hunter actually was effective in service.
Became a weapon of war indeed. Yes, you've obviously done your homework very well, Chris. The two Hunters that we've got flying are, I think, 2 out of approximately 35 left in the world in airworthy condition. And of course, just to return to the only airworthy Canberra in the world, 134 is her. You mentioned that her big Avon engines, probably not as fast as the Hunter. I can tell you from personal experience, the Hunter will not keep up with the Canberra in level flight.
Is that
low
right?
level. No.
Wow.
The Canberra gets away from her incredibly quickly.
And the two Hunters are T7, so that's the trainer version, side-by-side seating. Is that very different to fly from the single-seat aircraft?
I've never flown the single-seater. I can't actually say, but I do know from the old denizens of 234 Squadron that tell me that the T7 Hunter is actually, thanks to the area rules around the rear of the cockpit, is faster than the single-seater.
Really?
Very surprising.
Wow.
Indeed. Yeah.
We've got a treat in a few minutes. The Battle of Britain Memorial flight and our 4 aircraft based here are going to fly together, so we'll have a 7-fighter formation. The D-types are going round, so classic British engineering, Spitfires, Hurricanes, D-types, Hunters and Canberras. What more could you want? I would love to have been at Farnborough in 1958 when the black arrows combined with the blue diamonds and looped 22 Hunters in formation. I don't suppose you were there.
No, I wasn't there. In fact, I don't even want to say that our Hunter pilots were there, but
David Piper might have been.
David Piper and actually Rob Sargent, who's flying 577 for us, just coming by now. Rob's Air Force career is quite extraordinary in that he joined it shortly after leaving school, same school as me, ironically, and he's been in the Air Force ever since until early this year.
And staying in for a bit more?
No, he's out now and he's flying
out
with us, and he also is having fun because nobody's telling him what to do.
So one of the Hunters being flown by Gareth Walker, the other by Rob Sargent. Are they going off to do a bit of solo work? No, they're still in formation. Wonderful to see these aircraft.
I believe we're going to do a high-speed run by one of the Hunters, which will hopefully achieve the famous blue note, which is a combination of boundary layer hitting the Aiden cannon at the front and effectively making a very strange noise, which all the aficionados of the Hunter will recognise. So I'm hoping that that's what we'll get next.
It's rather like the Mustang's blue note, isn't
Yes,
it? But the Mustang is from the airflow across the gun ports.
Yeah.
The Hunter's a bit different.
It's a bit different. Apparently we can't do that with the Canberra, but I've certainly heard a very strange noise coming out of the Canberra at 500 knots.
Now at the Festival of Speed, the Hunter established a new hill record of about 21 seconds, as far as I remember.
No, I'm afraid it was 9.8 seconds.
9.8.
Yeah. But
Must have been cutting the corners a little bit.
That was done tongue-in-cheek. I believe Bernie Eccleston wants a steward's inquiry because apparently we knocked a bale down on the way up. But there we go.
So some really interesting spectators. We've got D-types going past. There's the lovely T7 Hunter. It's such a graceful shape. Six-cylinder Jaguar engines and 6 Avon Rolls-Royce jet engines.
Absolutely.
That's Goodwood, isn't it?
That's a lot of horsepower then.
That's a lot of horsepower. We might get a solo high-speed pass by one of the Hunters. It'd be lovely to hear the Hunter Blue Note and the D-type howl from the 6-cylinder straight-six Jaguar engine. But pretty soon we'll say goodbye to Canberra and Hunters. They'll go back to Bournemouth, but the good news is that they're back tomorrow and I believe Sunday as well.
And on Sunday as well, as a matter of fact.
Wonderful, Mike. Well, thanks so much for arranging for the Hunter and the Canberras to come and give us this lovely display. I believe this is am I right in saying your 20th display this year?
At the end of the weekend it will in fact be the 20th, that's correct, yeah. Which is not bad in one season, first season that the Mid-Air Squadron has in fact been in action.
And then a lot of maintenance over the winter?
Quite a bit of maintenance. The airplane's actually flown so much this summer that we've probably exceeded the RAF's utilisation of the aircraft in the last 20 years, so that's quite something.
And a possibility of some winter displays in the Mid-East. High-speed run. Hunters coming in from over Woodcote. Listen for that blue note. So we say high speed, Mike, but what's that, about 450 knots or so?
About that. We've got a problem with your crowd line. It's a curved display line, unfortunately, and the energy being thrown into the sky by those things. If we could do it in a straight line, it would be a lot quicker, but we can't get round the bend at the end, I'm afraid. But chaps in D-types know about that as well. Indeed.
The Canberra and the two Hunters have linked up, and I guess they're now flying off to the west. But if you're here all weekend, we'll have another 2 chances to see those 3 lovely airplanes again. Mike Davis, thanks so much for joining us. That's been really informative and a treat. Many thanks.
Chris, thanks very much.
So, Merlin engines and even with the ME-109, it's still a Merlin engine because that ME-109 is Spanish built. Messerschmitt gave the Spanish Air Force some airframes during the war, and they were meant to be built up with Daimler-Benz engines, but by the time the end of the war came, they hadn't received their Daimler-Benz engines. So in the late 40s, early 50s, they fitted the Merlin engine And the interesting thing is that the Daimler-Benz engine, a V12 like the Merlin, but upside down. So a very different propeller force line. With the Daimler-Benz engine, the propeller was much lower down. So the Spaniards had to do a lot of modification of the engine and engine cowling. And in fact, the driveline with the Merlin is 8 inches or so higher than with the Daimler-Benz, which I'm told makes it actually easier to fly. There's a future pilot. I don't know if he's aiming at D-types or aircraft, but the D-types, in fact, are still circulating. D-types doing a demonstration. Marcus is back with us. And it's nice to see the XKSSs. But the story, Marcus, I don't know if you've told the story of the XKSS, why it emerged. But the fact is that at the end of their production run, they'd made 67 or so D-types. Jaguar couldn't sell the remaining ones. Can you believe that? At 1,500 quid a pop or whatever it was. So they converted them into these two-seater sports cars with a windscreen and a kind of hood and a luggage rack on the back, called them XKSS, and they all sold, of course. Well, I'm not sure they did all sell, because they then had a factory fire in Browns Lane, didn't they? And maybe some of them were destroyed. But the XKSS looks like a nice, comfortable sports car. But in fact, if you try and sit in the passenger seat, there's not much room for your feet. You have to chop your legs off at the knees.
You're a bonsai passenger, really.
Yeah, bonsai passenger, exactly. The other thing I learnt, Marcus, about the D-type, which I never knew before, Norman Dewis told me, is that the wing, on the fin on the back, is not directly fore and aft. It's actually angled 5 degrees to the left.
I've heard the story before, and it's very interesting, and it's absolutely what it should have been.
I wonder if the people who make replica D-types know that. Some of them, I'm sure they do. French registered D-type, but still right-hand drive. Of course, you, I'm sure, know that the blue ones with the sergeants and corporal stripes are the ex-Écurie Écosse cars.
Écurie Écosse, which won at Le Mans in 56 and 57.
There's the Battle of Britain Memorial Flights Hurricane taking off. Much wider track than the Spitfire, much easier to handle on the ground. Of course, not so fast in the air.
I was up at Tony Ditheridge's Hawker Restoration Emporia a few weeks ago and saw 3 of these, an ex-Battle of Britain plane, another one that was awaiting a rebuilt engine, and another one they were restoring, which was still about a year away. And I was amazed in real terms as to what would buy a Hurricane. It's not as much as you'd think.
Have you noticed MH434 taking off? Lee Proudfoot, I think, flying MH434. Do you notice how much work he has to do on the rudder pedals to keep it straight on takeoff? There's a terrific amount of torque from the Merlin engine and that great huge propeller trying to pull the aircraft to the left. So you have to push a lot of right rudder in to keep it straight.
It's a lovely shot there with the Hurricane pulling out. Got the V12s overhead and the straight 6s on track.
And the XK engine that powers the D-type, really the layout of it was discussed and designed when Walter Haynes was up on the roof of the factory in Coventry watching for, well, what did they call it? Fire watching in those days, didn't they?
Well, I mean, the whole engine was debuted in '48, wasn't it? So
it was
a terrific piece of equipment.
And it was meant just to power the Mark 7s. They built the 120 as a sort of show car to demonstrate the new engine, and it was so popular that they decided they had to productionize it.
You would know, Chris, because you're a little older than I am, and also more knowledgeable in such things. Why did the Mark 7 come before the Marks 1 and 2?
Good question. Of course, the Mark 1 was never a Mark 1. It was just the Jaguar 240 and 340, and only when the Mark 2 came out did they refer it to as a
So
Mark
it was
1.
sort of retrospectively sort of given a kind of nickname.
It's like the DB1, which was never a DB1 until the DB2 came out. Hurricane and Spitfire. That's the old Flying Machine Company's Hurricane and MH434, the Mark 9 Spitfire. What's new to say about a Spitfire? Well,
We have a 4-ship display now.
isn't that wonderful?
Have you been down to the Freddie March Spirit of Aviation?
I have. I walked around it with Phil Whiteman, who's the editor of Pilot magazine, which is one of my Bibles. We had a good look at some of the lovely aircraft there. Do you know that in the mid-60s there were only 6 Spitfires flying in the world? And then various people, Doug Arnold, the Hayden Bailey brothers, Rob Lamplugh, Charles Church, they really led the search for Spitfires and started restoring them. And 40 were used as gate guardians outside RAF stations, and of course they were rotting in the rain. And a guy called Tim Routsis made a proposal to the Air Ministry to swap them for fiberglass replicas, which was wonderful because they took them all down, rebuilt them, and now we've got more than 40 Spitfires airworthy around the world.
And something like a dozen Hurricanes.
6 Hurricanes, I think.
I know there
And
have
more
been,
coming online
Yeah,
all
I know
the
there've
time.
been as many as 13 or 14.
Right.
Because Hawker Aviation, Hawker Restorations up there in Suffolk has been involved in the vast majority of them. Much more difficult to build and get running again.
There's a Goodwood connection with the Spitfire because the first flight of the Spitfire was flown by Supermarine's test pilot Mutt Summers, and he was the grandfather of one of our great bike racers and car racers here, Chas Mortimer. And a couple of years ago there was a replica of the prototype Spitfire in the Freddie March Spirit of Aviation Concours, and Chaz surprised them by going up to the people in charge of it and saying, "Hey, that was my grandpa flew that."
Awesome. And the first Spitfire flight from Eastleigh, now Southampton Airport.
Yep, that's right. And Mutt Summers is reputed to have landed and said, "Leave it, it's perfect." But I think he meant leave it for this afternoon, don't change it. I don't think he meant it was perfect.
Don't change the setup.
Because there were immense number of changes to the Spitfire between the prototype and the last one. So following these 5 British and 1 American fighter plane is the ME-109 Bouchon, which is the Merlin engined version of the 109. There's a lovely example of the elliptical wing of the Spitfire, very different from the ME-109. But John Romain, who's flying the ME-109, told me this morning that actually once you get it into the air, the ME-109 is a delightful aeroplane to fly, although it's very cramped in the cockpit. But during the war, the Luftwaffe lost a lot of pilots in landing and takeoff accidents in the 109 because it's a very twitchy and tricky aeroplane on the ground. John says it's okay here at Goodwood because the runway is like a lawn and the conditions are good. But just imagine a bumpy French field, overcast sky, probably pouring with rain, a tired pilot, just a recipe for an accident. I think we should not interrupt for a moment. Let's hear the wonderful song of the Merlins. So the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight Spitfires, it's a Mark II, a very early Spitfire, and the clipped wing Mark 16, which was designed primarily for ground attack, has a much greater rate of roll than the full elliptical wing ones. And so the 3 Battle of Britain Memorial Flight aircraft leading the 4 aircraft of the old Flying Machine Company I think Alistair Kay is flying the Mustang Ferocious Frankie this afternoon. John Romain flying the ME-109. Stu Goldspink flying the Hurricane. Lee Proudfoot flying the Mark 9 Spitfire. One thing we could say, but as long as Rolls-Royce aren't listening, is that the Packard Merlin was actually better built than the Rolls-Royce ones, because Packard had much more modern machinery, could build the aircraft, build the engine to much closer tolerances than Rolls-Royce, and so unlike Rolls-built Merlins, where you had to take a number of conrods, for instance, and weigh them all to get a nice match set, you could pretty much guarantee that 12 conrods from a Packard would all be of exactly the same weight. Look out, bird, you've got a Spitfire up your tail, and a Messerschmitt.
I think I'm right in saying there were some Rover Merlins, weren't there, as well, for marine use?
And tanks as well.
Yeah.
Rover, the Meteor engine, was a Merlin, I think unsupercharged, which was used in tanks.
Yeah, a friend of mine's putting one in an Alvis chassis. He wants to twin supercharge it before it goes in.
Perfect. Has it got any brakes?
Wouldn't have thought so. Only slow you down, apparently. Well, they've certainly got the cameras clicking. You talked about, I think you mentioned Patrick Lindsay somewhere down in that conversation about the aircraft with all the other guys who are into racing and aviation, etc. And Ludovic Lindsay, who's racing here this weekend, one of Patrick's three lads, has a son called Merlin, doesn't he?
Oh, does he?
Yeah, Merlin Cosmo, I think the sons are called from memory.
There's the clipped wing Mark 16 Spitfire of the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. Wheels down, curved final approach to land so that the pilot can see the runway along the side of the cowling. That's flown by Group Captain Johnny Stringer in his last day flying for the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight before he goes off to do a Staff College course leading to greater things. He hopes it doesn't involve flying a desk, but I suspect it probably will. He was station commander at Coningsby, where Battle of Britain Memorial Flight is based.
It's up in Lincolnshire, isn't it?
Yeah.
Near Cadwell Park for races.
Here comes Ferocious Frankie.
It seems to hang in the air.
It does, and unlike the Spitfire and Hurricane with Mustang, you can apply the brakes pretty hard because it's pretty tail heavy. Look at the air brakes on the Hurricane. So it's a much more docile aircraft, much wider track undercarriage, which retracts inwards, unlike the Spitfire one, which retracts outwards. And you can see the radiator behind the prop unblanked by undercarriage legs, so the Hurricane is much more tolerant on the ground. Wonderful air display. Maserati's coming out to play 250Fs as the aircraft come into land. And so pretty soon we'll say goodnight to aircraft. I think there is an evening flying display tomorrow. Of course, there'll be the dawn patrol, 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Hurricane landing. But we've got Maseratis coming out. So
well, it makes everything else pale into insignificance, but what a brilliant race, and what a brilliantly clean race. That is so important here at the Good Revival and historic motorsport as a whole. Chris Druitt to my right. Aviation fills our screens, and that makes the heart flutter, the hairs stand on end on the back of your neck, and the other side of the Goodwood equation.
Marcus, it does. Slight change of plan on the aviation display because the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight Lancaster had a technical problem overnight. They're flying in a new part from Coningsby, and optimistically they're pretty sure they can fix it to join us this afternoon. So 2 Lancasters in the sky over Goodwood this afternoon. In the meantime, 6 Merlin-powered aircraft led by the 3 aircraft of the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. That's 2 Spitfires and a Hurricane, followed by the locally based, or based this weekend, aircraft, the two Spitfires again, I beg your pardon, the Spitfire Hurricane and the ME-109, and they're going to be joined, as you can see on the big screen, by this wonderful Mustang, Ferocious Frankie, which I think today is being flown by Alistair Kay. So they're all Merlin engined, which sounds a bit crazy because an ME-109, but actually you can see the silver aircraft in the second trio is what's called a Bouchon, which was a Messerschmitt airframe delivered to Spain, and the Spaniards couldn't get the Daimler-Benz engine that the German Messerschmitts had, so post-war they fitted them with the Merlin engine, and it's called a Bouchon. So the three at the front belong to the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, and the two Spitfires are a Mark 16, that's the clipped wing version, and an early Mark II and the Hurricane. And the Mark 16, the clipped wing version, was built for a ground attack, has a much faster rate of roll than the full elliptical wing Spitfire, which you can see on the outside of that trio. That's the early Mark II. And the Mark 16 is being flown by Johnny Stringer in his last weekend flying for the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight before he goes off to Staff College. There on the big screen is the Mark 16. Just outside him, I think it's Tony Parkinson flying the Hurricane. And outside him, the much earlier Mark II, one of the very earliest Spitfires still flying. And they're followed by John Romain flying the ME-109, and then Lee Proudfoot flying the famous Mark 9 Spitfire MH434, and Stu Goldspink in the Hurricane. Difficult to think of things about Spitfires that haven't been said before, but one or two snippets. 1,000 Spitfires were delivered to Russia and flew in the combat on the Eastern Front, and the Spitfire actually flew in the RAF service until 1957 in the meteorological flight. And then lots of them were put on pedestals outside Royal Air Force stations as what they called gate guardians, and there they were, poor things, rotting away in the sun and the rain. And a guy called Tim Routsis made a proposal to the Air Ministry saying, I'll swap these for fiberglass models and rescue them, and that's exactly what happened, and that became a source of Spitfire restoration and spare parts. And in the mid-60s there were only 6 Spitfires airworthy in the world. Now there are more than 40. Another funny thing about the Spitfire is that in the early days they tried to fire the guns at 32,000 feet, which is pretty high, and because the machine guns had all frozen, they all jammed. And on one occasion, one of them landed at an airfield in Suffolk called Martlesham Heath, and landed, and that was okay, but then the guns unfroze and loosed off a round or two towards Felixstowe, which must have been a bit of a surprise. In the Battle of Britain, of course, the Hurricanes, their job was to go for the bombers, and in fact, Hurricanes accounted for more aircraft. There's another flying display for us. They accounted for more aircraft than the Spitfire, and the Hurricane was a great gun platform. But one of the disadvantages of the Merlin engine in the early days was that if you pushed the stick forward and, in other words, put in a lot of negative G, you wanted to dive very quickly, the engine coughed and cut out, which gave the ME-109, hovering, there you are, ME-109 a big advantage because the Daimler-Benz engine was fuel injected. And then a lady scientist at Farnborough called Beatrice Schilling designed a washer that stopped the surge of fuel going to the top of the carburetor and rescued the Merlin from coughing, and that subsequently was called Miss Schilling's orifice. Isn't it wonderful to see these historic aircraft? And it's interesting to compare the early technology of the Hurricane against the much or relatively later technology of the Spitfire, because the Hurricane has a tubular fuselage frame covered in fabric. In other words, it was pretty much a monoplane version of the Hawker Fury, which had certain advantages in that it was much easier to repair quickly in the field, Hurricane going up, because often the cannon shells would go through one side of the fuselage and out the other side, although it was pretty uncomfortable if it hit anything solid on the way. And the Hurricane was considerably less expensive to build than the Spitfire. It took 10,000 man-hours versus the 15,000 for the Spitfire. So in period, the Spitfire was a relatively expensive aeroplane. Have we been joined by the ferocious Frankie? So the aircraft are circling round. It may be that they're on their downwind leg to land, although the undercarriages aren't done. Ferocious Frankie, the Mustang, I hope does a high-speed pass. The aircraft are in fact coming into land. But if you see the Mustang diving at high speed, you'll hear the characteristic whistle of the Mustang, which is the wind blowing across the gun ports at the front of the wings. There we go. Spitfire landing. Not an easy plane to land, because as you can see on the big screen, when you're sitting behind that engine, you can't see anything ahead. So here comes the second Spitfire doing the characteristic curved final approach, so that the pilot could look down the left-hand engine cowling, and have a bit of a glimpse of the runway before he lands. Hurricane was much easier because the pilot was relatively sitting further up, and the undercarriage is much wider space. So the Hurricane was a slightly easier aircraft to land than the Spitfire. Although once in the air, everybody who's flown a Spitfire agrees that it is the most delightful airplane to fly. Okay, back to Marcus while these aircraft land.
Thank you very much for that, Chris, as the Hurricane comes into land. Let's hear from our Goodwood Revival commercial partners.
And back up to you for final farewells.
Well, what a climax, what a wonderful race, but an amazing climax to our day here at Goodwood Revival, with a sight that we probably will never see again. Two Lancasters in the sky together, with the two Spitfires and Hurricane at the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. The Lancaster is the one built in Canada, has flown in Canada for some time, but crossed the Atlantic this year and has joined the airshow circuit for a month or two. We'll be going back to Canada pretty soon. It's flown by David Rohrer. It was built in Canada, funnily enough, in July 1945, so it never saw action, and in 1952 it had a serious accident that meant it needed a new wing. Then it went on maritime patrol in Canada, and then was out on outside display in Canada from 1963 to 1977, so that didn't do it any good at all. And then it, in 77, had an 11-year rebuild, and so it flew again in 1988. It's dedicated to Canadian Flight Lieutenant Andrew Minarski, who earned the Victoria Cross, saving his rear gunner, who was trapped in the downed aircraft, and it survived, but Andrew Minarski sadly didn't survive, so it's a fitting tribute to him. And there's a close-up of the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight Lancaster, piloted by Tim Dunlop. Again, that one was built in 45, didn't see action in the war, went into storage, then it went off to South Africa, and they were going to put it on static display in the RAF Museum in Hendon, but fortunately it was rescued in 67 and went through a complete rebuild, joined the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight in 1973, and has been constantly, of course, maintained in beautiful flying condition. Lots of Lancasters were built, and sadly, lots of them were lost. 7,300, can you believe that? 7,377 Lancasters built between 41 and 46, and of those, 3,500 were lost on operations. unbelievable. And 73,000 young men of the Royal Air Force died in their, not only in Lancasters, but in their other bombers. So it's great that the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight is a tribute to those brave young men. Remember, they were sort of 19, 20, 21, flying these incredible aircraft. And it's appropriate that the two Lancasters are accompanied by the two Spitfires, two of the Spitfires belonging to Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. One of them is a very early one. The one you can see now just behind the Lancaster on the big screen is the later one, the Mark 16, with the clipped wings, and thereby in echelon behind him is the elliptical wing, very early one, a Mark 2. And with them, of course, is the wonderful Hurricane. A much earlier technology, steel tube frame with fabric covering, so that had certain advantages in terms of repair in the field, but of course it wasn't as quick as the Merlin, although it turned nice and tightly. I'm joined by Doug Nye, who does know more about Spitfires than I do, probably. But isn't it wonderful? How, 1, 2, 3, 4, we've got 8, 9, 10, 11 Merlin engines there. V12, of course, built by Rolls-Royce, designed by Rolls-Royce, but also built by Packard in the States. The Lancasters turn back. They're going back to Bournemouth. And we should congratulate the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight engineers, because the British Lancaster went tech. In other words, it broke down overnight in Bournemouth, and they flew in the appropriate spare part from Coningsby, and the guys have worked flat out all day to repair the Lancaster. It was due to fly lunchtime today, but isn't it wonderful to have the two Lancasters in the air over Goodwood today? Unbelievable. There is a third Lancaster in this country, or what I mean is a second Lancaster in this country, a third Lancaster, which hopefully will eventually fly. It's owned by two lovely farmers, delightful farmers, called the Fenton brothers in East Kirby near Boston in Lincolnshire. They bought it in the 80s as a tribute to their brother who died in Bomber Command. It runs, the engines run, it's in pretty good condition, but to restore it to flying condition is going to take a lot of money and a lot of time. But wouldn't it be wonderful to have two Lancasters flying in this country? Low pass over Goodwood by the Hurricane this side and the clipped wing Spitfire the other side. Mark 16 I thought was going to demonstrate its very rapid roll rate that Johnny Stringer was telling me about yesterday. That was the advantage of the clipped wing, because that aircraft was used for ground attack. On the screen, look, the two Lancasters. Isn't that wonderful? There's on the screen again the Mark 16 Spitfire.
Chris, did you see the wonderful camera work there, where the planes appeared to be flying through the Union flag?
Wasn't that wonderful?
Gorgeous.
Yes. So many things to say about the Spitfire. First flew in 1936, and the test pilot who first flew the Spitfire, his grandson, competed here for many years, both on two wheels and four, Chas Mortimer. And it was a treat when he told me, it was a big surprise that Mutt Summers was his grandfather. He said he was quite a gruff character. So here's the Mark 16 coming into land. Semicircular approach, of course, so that the pilot can look round the nose to see where the runway is. At this point, he loses sight of the runway, looks to the side to make sure that he's landing straight. Slight crosswind, but a beautiful landing. Perfect. And Johnny Stringer, who's this is probably his last weekend flying these wonderful airplanes. He's going off to greater things with the Royal Air Force. Careful not to put the brakes on too hard, doesn't want to tip it on its nose. In comes the Hurricane, which is wider tracked, slightly easier to land than the Spitfire. But again, like all tailwheel aircraft, it bounces a little bit, but that's the undulations on the grass. You notice he doesn't have to be so energetic on the rudder to keep it straight. What a lovely climax to a wonderful day at Goodwood Revival this year. The Mark II Spitfire, can't see it at the moment. Maybe has landed, maybe it's still to land. But I believe just before the party, as always, we'll have the dusk display, flying display, over the party by Ferocious Frankie and by MH434 Spitfire MH434. I think they will be flown by Lee Proudfoot and Alistair Kane. First time I came to Goodwood Revival, first time I went to the party, those two aircraft did their
upon civilian society support of the armed services. June the 6th this year marked the 7th anniversary of Operation Overlord, the D-Day landing, the Allies' first great move to liberate France from occupation, and by extension to bring lasting peace to mainland Europe. Our Goodwood Aerodrome and its Sussex neighbours all played a critical role in ensuring the success of that incredible campaign. Today, right here on this starting grid, we will very shortly be joined by 23 D-Day veterans. We are really honoured to have them with us. These are men to whom we are so grateful, yet too seldom have the opportunity to show it. Now, I'd ask you all to turn to the screens around you and recalling gratitude, West Sussex at War, narrated by my sister, Lily March. Thank you very much indeed for being with us.
"75 years ago, in 1939, events far from the rolling hills of West Sussex were the catalyst for us being here today. In that year, the grass aerodrome known as RAF westhapnett first saw serious service. The land here had been Westhapnett Farm, part of this southwestern corner of the Goodwood estate. But as the international situation worsened, Freddie March of Goodwood allowed development on his land, a satellite aerodrome to support the major fighter base just across the fields nearby, at Tangmere. So it was that Westhapnett farmhouse and its barns were demolished, hedgerows cleared, lanes filled, and the whole plain levelled. Our aerodrome here then became a vital Battle of Britain base in 1940, and its active war would rage far into 1944. When the first RAF men and women reported here in 1939, the lucky ones lived jam-packed in the old farm cottages, but many more lived in leafy tents, and some even in a converted pigsty. Tangmere was smothered by bombing, which RAF Westhapnett here escaped, along with the fighter squadron carried on inside. From 1940 to 1944, ever more permanent buildings popped up. Squadron offices, the control tower, cannons, power supply levels, steel farms, ammunition, all had to be staffed and serviced, while the unavoidable activities of a world war no one ever wanted went on.
Good luck. Good luck.
Westbourne House School became an office and mess for 150 Commonwealth officers. Hepworth House was taken over by the East Riding Yeomanry, and across the country buildings were requisitioned for the purpose. Throughout West Sussex, ordinary citizens became into the cost by guard, air raid orders, farmers, factory workers, ground crew, firemen, police, doctors, nurses, wives, families, all play vital roles in keeping the country as the essential war effort state. Their daily heroism and fortitude are opportunities. Trees were constantly formed. Every possible road, fertile land, fully farmed. Local land welcomed the land army. The home farm devoted time, dedication, patience. Remote men fought, factories relied upon in a world-class way. Here at Goodwood, wartime winters were harsh. Some sunbathing deck chairs in June and July, and burning the wooden cottage staircases just to keep warm from December and January. Local halls and manor houses did common duty just as much as the servicemen and women living. Over the 6 years of World War II, Sussex survived 150,000 enemy bombs. There was very few Pageant told me how to keep it all down in 142. While RAF Tangier became a secret centre, shuttling SOE agents in and out of France, RAF Westhapnett housed Douglas Bader's fighter wing, with squadrons ranging far and wide across continental France. The very first American Air Force Pittsburgh squadron fighting nearby, Stormy Island is surely housed squadrons of Lenin and Bonaparte. By 1944, a new additional Allied force had been building up. Our Sussex lanes, roads, villages, were jam-packed with tanks, trucks, guns, and ambulances. A million men and more were forced. Large-scale rehearsals were held on the planet. During the unauthorized movement on land from the jam-packed waters and hangars to the army, fishing vessels continued to coast. Landing craft were made focused on and bombs. And on June 6, 1944, 70 years ago, that force was unleashed. Operation Overlord became the greatest single military operation in history. Massive promising Allied force on land, sea, and air, projected clear across the English Channel. RAF Westhapnett taken the Russian arm and its many other local farmland areas, now long
What a wonderful climax to this terrific parade of West Sussex, of Sussexton War. The two Lancasters, a sight that we won't see again, and we haven't seen for 70 years or so. Battle of Britain Lancaster, accompanied by the Canadian Lancaster that's been over in this country for a couple of months doing some lovely displays, piloted by David Rohrer. The Battle of Britain Memorial Flight Lancaster piloted by Tim Dunlop, and the two Spitfires of the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight and the Hurricane. And the Hurricane is being flown by Group Captain Johnny Stringer in maybe his last weekend flying with the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight before he moves on to even greater things. And the Mark 16 Spitfire, the one with clipped wings, flown by Tony Parkinson, and the early Spitfire, the Mark 2A, flown today by Dunk Mason. The Lancaster, of course, 7,377 Lancasters were built between 1941 and 1946, and of those 3,500 were lost on operations, and another 200 or so were destroyed or written off in crashes. And so we have to remember, and I'm sure we do, that they were flown by 19, 20, 21-year-old lads who were doing what they were told, and 73,000 of them didn't come back. So it's highly fitting that we pay tribute to the bravery of those young men, without whom we wouldn't be enjoying this glorious weekend at Goodwood Revival. Well-deserved applause for our line of jeeps, half-tracks, trucks of the American Army, trucks of the British Army, and if we look well back towards the chicane, the Rolls-Royce, and particularly in each jeep one of our 23 D-Day veterans. And I had the privilege of speaking earlier to Johnny Ainsworth, who's one of the 23, and it's quite fitting that on the big screen each of their names was inscribed, and they'll be remembering their pals who didn't come back from D-Day and afterwards. Let's hope they're enjoying their day. I know they've had lots of things to do this morning before the parade. Proudly wearing their medals and the Royal Artillery badge on that veteran's beret. First time I think we've seen a tank driving up the finishing straight at Goodwood, certainly the first time since about 1944. And we forget how many societies exist to preserve these wartime vehicles of all varieties, and it's lovely that we've got the civilian population lining up on the finishing straight, waving their Union flags, some of them dressed as Land Army girls, because without the Land Army girls this country would have had great difficulty feeding itself. And it's appropriate that one of the last vehicles to come up the finishing straight is an old Fordson tractor representing the Land Army. And the Rolls-Royce, I'm not sure if it's Field Marshal Montgomery's own Rolls-Royce, but it would be highly appropriate if it were. So all our military vehicles going right round the circuit, and in 5 minutes' time the Tourist Trophy is scheduled to start, but I think it would be quite appropriate if it were delayed to allow this great parade to conclude with dignity. 23 D-Day veterans, and John Ainsworth telling me the secret work done by the Royal Artillery in 1940 after Dunkirk with some microphones, must have been very sophisticated microphones in Kent, with which they could triangulate. They could pick up the sound of the artillery the other side of the channel in occupied France, where the German guns were firing both on shipping in the channel, and they bombarded Dover, of course, and by triangulating on those sounds of those guns, they were able to do something about them. The Jeep, isn't it wonderful to see so many Jeeps still in great condition? Jeep was an amazing vehicle, able to withstand just about anything, dig itself out of and through very muddy fields. Four-wheel drive, nice torquey engine, the perfect vehicle to get around, and also to extract wounded soldiers from the battlefield. So it'll take a little bit of time for our civilians to return to the outside of the circuit. His Royal Highness Prince Michael is with us. And turning our attention to the air again, the Freddie March Spirit of Aviation Concorde, which I hope you've been to look at. It's got some wonderful aeroplanes. The judging has been taking place for that, and we'll, I hope, hear pretty soon which of the airplanes has been judged to be the winner of the Concorde. Very difficult decision to make because they're all in wonderful condition. They're all historic aircraft, lovingly tended by their owners, and they'll be flying away. Some of them will fly away this evening, some of them will wait until tomorrow, but some of them you're surprised that they were able to land here at Goodwood. There's a C-47 Dakota, which is quite a big airplane to get into our grass runway here. Although last year, I think it was last year or the year before, actually a B-17 bomber landed. Westhapnett Aerodrome, where Douglas Bader took off for his final mission. Of course, he was shot down, bailed out of his Hurricane, and leaving one of his artificial legs behind. And in a strange cooperation between the German Air Force and the Royal Air Force, they agreed for the Royal Air Force to fly a spare leg over and drop it on an aerodrome in occupied France, so that Douglas Bader got his missing leg back. Next on the program, the highlight race for many people, the Royal Automobile Club TT Celebration, which is an hour-long race, two-driver race, of course, and if you're near the pits, and we've got cameras in the pits, of course, halfway through the race, you'll see some amazing Fred Carno's Army action as one driver gets hauled out of the car and the replacement driver gets shoved in, straps done up. And I'm sure you could see from the grandstand, and particularly from above the pits, what a narrow lane it is. It's a very frantic place with very busy traffic. You can actually open the driver's door of a left-hand drive car, and a following car could hardly squeeze its way through. So there's masses of entertainment both on the circuit and in the pits. Our next air display, incidentally, is scheduled for 15 minutes past 3, and that'll be take us through up into the jet age with the Canberra and the two Hunters of the Mid-Air Squadron. They've flown here for the two previous days and do a wonderful display demonstrating early British jet age technology, surprisingly fast, surprisingly powerful, 6 Rolls-Royce Avon jet engines making that glorious noise. And the Hunter, I think, epitomizes the motto, if it looks right, it is right, because the Hunter went on to serve for more than 50 years in various air forces around the world. And I'm rejoined by Marcus Pye, who, together with Bruce Jones, will be commentating on the Royal Automobile Club TT. Last year, you'll remember, in horrible conditions, it was a wonderful race, finally won by Simon Hadfield, Wolfgang Friedrichs in the wonderful Project 212 Aston Martin, surprising Anthony Reid, Marcus, in the Lister Coupe.
Well, I think it surprised Aston Martin and its aficionados.
I think it did. And I seem to recall Simon saying it was only after the end of the race that he found the wiper switch.
That's absolutely right, yeah.
And there's a great YouTube video produced by Chris Harris, who was sharing the Lister Coupe with Anthony Reid, with quite a lot of in-car footage, during which you see Anthony grabbing a sponge from, if you like, above the sun visor and attempting to wipe the condensation off the inside of the screen.
That's what James Hunt famously said, wasn't he? He said, always keep a damp rag between your legs.
Typical James. Our grid girls are in position. Fortunately, we've got glorious weather. We've had wonderful weather all 3 days, or 4 days if we include Thursday.
I think we've been truly blessed.
We have indeed. Bruce, did you get to see the military parade past your St Mary's Tower?
It hasn't finished coming past. The last
really?
ones are just coming into the kink. It's been extraordinary. I thought, gosh, it's the world's biggest historical display. And then I saw there was at least twice as much still coming around the far side of the circuit. Absolutely brilliant. You couldn't say there's not the whole range on display here today.
I can't imagine anything. Well, I don't think we saw any field guns being towed behind a tank or anything like that.
No, we didn't, but I'm just wondering how many farms had things like this tucked away in use until the 60s and possibly by the 70s starting to get phased out. But all these Jeeps coming past, gosh, quite extraordinary. And I can now see the Rolls-Royce that is bringing up the rear of the display, and it's fantastic to see the reception that these veterans of D-Day have received around the circuit. We hope they're having a fabulous, fabulous time here at the Revival.
We have.
Very excited. Jet aircraft at that.
Yes. Moved on 10 years or so from World War II. I'm joined by Ian Brett of the Mid-Air Squadron. Mid-Air Squadron bring the Canberra and the two Hunters. Canberra first flew last year. Hunters, Ian, one flew last year. I haven't seen the pair of them flying together.
Hello, Chris, ladies and gentlemen. Revival, good afternoon. Yeah, that's right. We've got two Hunters today flanking the Canberra. So we've got the iconic Canberra flanked by the two supersonic Hunter jet fighter aircraft. Just as you put your eyes to the sky, just look, they're going to swoop down for another high-speed pass.
Hunter first flew in 51, Canberra first flew in 1949 and stayed in service until about 2007, so an enormously long service career. Hunter in, I think, the Lebanon was still active in 2008. Both wonderful airplanes. Canberra operated up to about 72,000 feet, which is enormously high. This particular one, photo reconnaissance.
That's right, this is a photo reconnaissance, the PR9. It's the only one flying in the world anywhere, so you'll not see this formation anywhere else in the world, and it's a unique formation to Mid-Air Squadron, putting the Canberra airborne with these two Hunters, so it's unique. You will not see it anywhere else, just as they're just changing formation position to line astern, just as they change to do another high-speed fly past, reaching speeds of up to 650 miles an hour and down to heights of about 100 feet above the ground. There's been lots of excitement on the track with wheels and piston engines. We're now looking to the skies for jet engines, wings, and speeds of up to 650 miles an hour.
Ian, is it Mike Leckie flying the Canberra today?
Mike Leckie, yep, he's in the Canberra, so he's going to be leading the Hunters for this next pass. All our pilots are highly experienced Air Force pilots, instructors, and very experienced display pilots. You can see them beautifully showing off the elegance and the beauty of these jet aircraft in the sky today. So just look at them as they come through now, sun glinting off the beautiful silver paint scheme. Just listen to the 4 Avon engines as they roar past.
The two Hunters are both T7 models, so you can see the wide cockpit side-by-side training version of the Hunter. which Mike Davis told me on Friday actually is more aerodynamic than the super-seater.
Yeah, absolutely right. It is, as you can see, it's a beautifully sleek aeroplane. It looks good, it feels good, and it flies beautifully as well.
Ian, are we going to hear the blue note from the Hunter in a high-speed pass?
Absolutely. So they're just going to be splitting for a high-speed pass. So a very unique sound that the Hunters will make. The Hunters will come through first, followed by the Canberra. We're getting up to 700 miles an hour now for this low-level, high-speed fly past. Your time will stand still for this, and the hairs on the back of your neck will certainly be prickling.
And
very emotive.
Don't forget the Hunter holds the hill record at the Festival of Speed with a time of 9-point-something seconds.
Absolutely. We still hold the hill record, which we plan to break again next year. And these pilots flying these aircraft have survived combat missions over many years. These aeroplanes have survived combat over many years around the world. And we're delighted with Mid-Air Squadron to bring them to you. So let the jets do the talking. Listen for the noise.
So the blue note of the Hunter, aerodynamic. And here comes the Canberra, again a high-speed run.
Absolutely. Beautiful sound from the Hunters. Here comes the Canberra. Wow, what a roar, what a sight. That's absolutely beautiful. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed the unique formation of the Canberra and the two Hunters. Can't see anywhere else in the world, presented by Mid-Air Squadron, who are delighted to be here at the Revival to entertain you this afternoon.
And Ian, are those now going back to Kemble?
Yeah, back to Kemble, based out of Kemble. So we've been flying out of Bournemouth all weekend. Now we're just shooting straight back to Kemble. So it's a 12-minute transit from Bournemouth. It'll be a few minutes longer than that, back to Kemble to take some fuel on and get ready for our next air display.
And I should tell you that Ian, up here in the commentary box, who trains RF pilots on Grob Tutors, has actually recently qualified on the Hunter. So next year, Ian will be flying the Hunter for us.
That's right, I'm the newest qualified Hunter pilot on the team with Mid-Air Squadron, and I'm delighted to be part of the team, and like you say, I'll be displaying it hopefully here again next year.
And keep your focus in the air. The Hurricane has taken off. Does that mean the Battle Britain Memorial flight is on its way home? I think it does. No, it's the Hispano-Bouchon ME-109, so we're going to get a display soon from our Goodwood-based aircraft during the Revival. Oh, Spitfire with the D-Day markings. One of the undercarriage wheels has failed to retract. That's the Mustang. Has that Spitfire still got one undercarriage leg dangling? Or was it the Mustang? I think the Mustang failed to retract its undercarriage, so is Alistair Kay bringing it round straight back in. He's on his downwind leg now. Of course, if it failed to retract, has it locked down? Well, Alistair, if he hasn't got two greens on his instrument panel indicating two wheels down and locked, he won't come back to Goodwood. He'll go back to Duxford. Meanwhile, the Spitfire Mark 9 MH434 with both wheels retracted stays in the sky. The good news is that the Mustang has two greens. Both undercarriage legs are locked down, so drama but not a crisis. But it means that our next display will be the two ship, the Spitfire and the Hurricane together, unless they all decide to land, but I suspect they won't. There's the Spitfire on the big screen. And of course we've got the ME-109, the Merlin-powered Messerschmitt also in the sky. So maybe a 3-ship formation rather than 4. Is the Mustang on final, coming into land? One eye on the sky, one eye on the ground. But let's talk about these 3 wonderful aircraft of the old Flying Machine Company. MH434, the Mark 9 Spitfire, fought in the war. There are the 2 protagonists from the Battle of Britain, although in fact that's the Hurricane and the ME-109. And if this was 1940, the Hurricane pilot would be seriously worried, because the ME-109 was a quicker and more nimble aircraft. Now, that's Alistair Kay, I think, flying the Mustang, with Lee Proudfoot probably, or John Romaine. Now, I think John Romaine is flying the ME-109, but the Spitfire accompanying the Mustang to make sure that it may be that it's going to fly wheels down all the way back to Duxford. We shall soon find out. Ian, with me still from Mid-Air Squadron, is in contact with air traffic control, so Ian might well be able to put me in the picture. I suspect it's back to Duxford for a careful landing on the grass there. Both aircraft show with the black and white stripes indicating the D-Day markings that Allied aircraft sported in June 1944. Meanwhile, Hurricane and Spitfire, Hurricane, I beg your pardon, and ME-109 in close formation overhead. ME-109, originally of course the German version, fitted with a Daimler-Benz inverted V12 engine, but the Spaniards bought the airframes from Germany, but they didn't get any Daimler-Benz engines. So they, post-war, they fitted them with Merlin engines, which meant a different thrust line, of course, for the engine, which involved a certain degree of modification. In fact, that's ME-109 and Hurricane. Peter Vasher's Hurricane, which is for sale if you've got a handy 3 million quid. The ME-109, a very beautiful airplane to fly once it's in the air, but tricky on takeoff and landing. They do another low pass. I think the Mustang and Spitfire probably on their way back to Duxford. We'll get confirmation of that pretty soon. Back to Duxford in Cambridgeshire, probably 20 minutes, 25 minutes flight, but a lot of discussion, of course, about the security of the undercarriage. But with 3 greens, with 2 greens on the control panel, which should indicate that the undercarriage is down and locked. Alistair Kay at the control column, one of the most experienced pilots we've got. He'll make sure it's a very, very gentle landing. Hurricane, it's almost a pre-war design and construction, fabric body. We've got the cars for the Jackie Stewart celebration coming round to the start line, so pretty soon we'll hand back to Marcus and the motorcar team for this celebration of our famous world champion, who's here of course with his family. 50 years since that memorable day when Jackie for the first time hopped in a single-seater Formula 3 Cooper and astonished John Cooper and all the other onlookers with his speed and smoothness. So we need to have eyes on the ground and eyes in the air as the ME-109 and the Hurricane continue their display on the big screen. A good indication of the Hurricane wing, very different shape from that of the Spitfire, much thicker wing, an easier aircraft to land, much wider based undercarriage than the Spitfire. So hopefully we'll have a camera on focused on the Hurricane when it comes into land, but in the meantime, lots of interest coming up the finishing line.